annual Seymour Riklin Memorial Lecture. I'm going to say a word to introduce our provost, Dr. Keith Whitfield, and he's going to welcome us, and we'll go from there. Dr. Keith Whitfield has kindly agreed to take a moment out of his busy schedule, so he has to move on, to welcome us. He has a distinguished academic career. He's coming from Duke University, from medicine and psychology and neuroscience, and I will let him take the floor.
Now, don't show off for our guests by just clapping for the provost. I appreciate it. Well, absolutely fantastic to be here. This is something that, even though my schedule has been a little crazy, actually very crazy today, I think this is going to be the highlight of it. I'm not going to be able to stay too terribly long, but I think being able to be here for this memorial lecture is something that we as a campus are really going to get to benefit from, and to think very, very deeply about important questions that actually face our city here. So I've got all of these remarks, you write them down, and then I don't pay any attention to them, I just start talking, but I did want to tell you guys a quick story. So I tell this story quite often, but to folks in philosophy, you might think about it differently. So when I was in school, I was in a classroom at 8 o'clock in the morning in a pink room. And they say that pink actually is very calming and, settles people down, puts babies to sleep, all that kind of stuff. I was in this pink room. And I sat in the very, very back right-hand side of the class. And as I was sitting there, there's this great post that sits next to me. And I lean against it and get very, very comfortable. But remember, I'm a sophomore. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, one fine day in this particular class, I decide that I'm a little too sleepy and I start to fall asleep. And I start to fall out of my chair. And I wake up as the floor is coming towards my face. And I decide, so there's a two-choice decision to make here. Either I just fall on the ground, or I catch myself and I'm going to stand up in the middle of class. And I decide the latter. I'm not going to fall down. I stand up. The professor looks at me and he says, well, Mr. Whitfield, do you have anything to add? And I went, not just yet. But that opportunity actually got me engaged in paying attention to this class that I had been kind of half sleeping through. And I found out that I really enjoyed this class. It was really actually exciting. And it's so funny when I tell this story, I tell it a little differently, because I think about what we were supposed to actually accomplish in that class. It was a class on philosophy. It was about thinking about the universe. And I always think, I went into that class thinking, it's philosophy, what's that going to be about, what's that going to be like, and even trying to think about the whole universe, and they're going to fit it into one semester. But actually, that philosophical perspective about thinking, I think as we sit at a Research One institution, sometimes we think about that there's lots of STEM that goes on, and do we actually pay attention to the social sciences and the arts and humanities? In my mind, they go hand in hand. That the way that we make great thinkers is through areas, fields, disciplines like philosophy, to make sure that we're thinking very, very deeply about the difficult questions that arise in STEM fields or anything else. So, now to my prescribed remarks. I'm amazed on a daily basis on the wonderful history of leading academic scholars and researchers we have here at Wayne State University. This has happened over the course of 150 years we celebrate next year. But it's interesting, even with that distinguished past, one of the highest honors that comes as a characterization of many of our faculty, in my mind anyway, is that when we consider someone to be a Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman, I learned that in my philosophy class too. And Dr. Riklin is one of those unique individuals for which this memorial lecture is named after. He was a major figure in humanities education and someone who helped to craft what I like to call the cultural Detroit we benefit from today. He worked in radio, he worked in television, he was an educator, He was known for always pursuing knowledge. So as you know, we have a city right now that's going through a sort of Renaissance period itself. And part of that growth is a struggle to consider how race plays into economic growth and development. How fitting that we have our guest here today, Dr. Gordon, to share his thoughts on thinking race constructively. Thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon. This really says something about dedication and the excitement that we have for your presentation today. I know that all of you are looking forward to this lecture as I am. So with that, thank you very much.
So in a minute, Johnny Cottrell will introduce our speaker, Louis Gordon. This is the 20th annual, I should say, I'm Eric Hiddleston, interim chair, temporary chair, reluctant chair of the philosophy department. In a minute, Johnny will introduce our speaker, Louis Black, but this is the 20th annual Seymour Riklin Memorial Lecture. And so I thought I'd take just a minute to say something about Seymour Riklin first, and because he's the person in whose honor we have this event every year. Seymour Riklin was born in Russia and emigrated to the United States as a small child. He was educated in public schools in Detroit, and he continued on to get a master's degree in English at the University of Chicago and a master's degree in philosophy at the University of Michigan. He taught classes at Wayne State and other places. He was involved in numerous generally humanistic activities in Detroit and in education in Detroit. I wrote some down. I won't bother to say, but I'll mention just a couple of things. He was involved with the Metro Arts. Assistant Director of the Arts Council of Metropolitan Detroit, which had a number of different activities, one of which was a film series, which later became the DFT, the Detroit Film Theater. And he was a co-founder of that. And he was active throughout his life. He had a passion for knowledge, both in his own case and for education and for bringing scholarly and humanistic concerns to as wide an audience as possible. And so it's in his memory and continuing those aims that we have this lecture every year. So let me introduce Jonathan Cottrell, who will introduce our speaker. Jonathan Cottrell is Assistant Professor in the
Thanks, Keith and Eric, and thank you everyone for coming. The philosophy department is honored to welcome Louis Gordon as the 20th Riklin lecturer. Dr. Gordon is professor of philosophy and African American studies with affiliations in Judaic studies, Latin and Caribbean studies, and Asian American studies at the University of Connecticut at Storrs. He also has positions at the Global Center for Advanced Studies and at Rhodes University in South Africa. His resume defies easy summary. He is an extraordinarily prolific and wide-ranging scholar. He is a Renaissance man to rival Seymour Riklin. Within philosophy, his research interests include Africana philosophy, phenomenology and the philosophy of existence, social and political philosophy, philosophy of culture, aesthetics, philosophy of education, and philosophy of science. But his interests are by no means limited to academic philosophy. His work also engages with politics, with education, and with music. He has authored or co-authored 9 books, by my count, including Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, which received the Book Award from the African American Studies and Research Center at Purdue University, and Her Majesty's Other Children, Sketches of Racism from a Neo-Colonial Age, which received the Gustavus Myers Outstanding Book Award for the study of human rights in North America. He's also edited or co-edited numerous other books. He has authored well over 100 articles and chapters in academic journals and collections, and he has given distinguished lectures the world over. As well as his academic work, he's written many articles for a non-academic audience, and he has given interviews for or participated in numerous journals, magazines, radio programs, podcasts, and documentaries for television and cinema. So there's nobody better suited to give the Seymour Riklin Memorial Lecture, which is designed to bring a broader public to philosophy. So would you all please join me in welcoming Professor Gordon.
Thank you, Johnny. To begin with, Louis Black is one of my favorite comedians. And I take the psychoanalytical reference to him as something very positive, since we're both Jews. In addition to that, I'd like to begin first by also mentioning how delighted I am to be here at Wayne State and here in Detroit for a variety of reasons. One of them, it's interesting, is the Adamani Library. When I decided to leave Brown University, I decided I wanted to go to a public university. And the person who contacted me insisted that he wanted me to join where he was working turned out to be David Adamani. So, as you know, he's passed away, but I take it that life has this way of making some things go full circle. In addition to that, as a child, you see the gray in the beard, but if I shave, some people think I'm younger than I am, but I remember the days where, if you're a black and you want to listen to music, you know where it was coming from. It's coming from this town. So there's already imprinted this special relationship to the Motor City. But even beyond that, if you're involved in political issues, public issues, the Motor City comes up. So I've spoken here before, and each time it has this feeling of reverence. So I begin first with Shalom, Salam Alaikum, and I was born in Jamaica, so how you keeping? And I hope you're all keeping well. Now, the additional thing is, when I looked at this lecture, the Riklin Lecture, something immediately came to mind. And it's a story from a good old friend. His name is Calvin Schrag. And Calvin Schrag, when he was a student at Harvard, he was studying for his PhD, and it was time for him to choose an advisor. And Schrag decided he wanted to work with Paul Tillich. So he went to ask the DGS of philosophy, to let him know he's going to work with Paul Tillich. And the DGS said, "You want to work with Tillich? He's a thinker, not a philosopher." Now really think about what that means. So in a way, what's one of the beautiful things about this idea of, about philosophy for the public, Riklin has done something wonderful by putting this series, by the work he did in this city, but also this department, by putting such a series together. But the unfortunate thing as well is that a lot of people don't really know the history of philosophy proper. A lot of the people we consider to be great philosophers were actually publicly engaged philosophers, what Jean-Paul Sartre called philosophers engagés, committed philosophers. Malcolm X had something wonderful to say around that issue, which is if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And so philosophers proper stand for something, okay? Now, what I'm going to talk about today, it struck me, this lecture is to deal with something public, and word has it that race and racism, well, those are pretty public matters, aren't they? especially not only in these times, but in this epoch. But what I'm going to do is, instead of being didactic, I'm going to offer some concepts, some ideas that I hope you will find useful. Okay? It's very weird when philosophers cease to be useful, isn't it? You know, not only to bring some William James in, but actually to bringing the rich history of what philosophers were about. So I'm hoping, when I say useful, I don't mean simply application, but also that you leave here with something that at least develop a new relationship to how you think about these issues than you had before. So I begin with the first point. Now, the first point is a particularly neurotic problem in this society. It's not just here, it's in a lot of the European societies as well, and also in South America, but it's a particularly neurotic situation, which is to talk about race, just to talk about it at all, is something very difficult to do, because from the moment everyone is born in this country, you're being practically bullied intellectually. You're being encouraged, you're being discouraged rather, from talking about it at all. All right? It's that thing that's everywhere, but you're to pretend it is nowhere. What makes matters even worse is if you're a person who studies or theorizes about this issue, you're expected to do it so long as you say what you are doing is illegitimate. Now that's pretty weird. Can you imagine? Hey, I'm a chemist, but I don't believe in elements. Yeah, I do biology, but life. Physics, but you know. What the hell is nature anyway? So it's very weird, but already there's this guardedness, okay? So you're supposed to do a neurotic thing. You're supposed to announce an expertise in something that is supposed to be illegitimate. So that already makes the task you have to do, if you're talking about race or racism, a very difficult one. To make matters even worse, the consequences of the way people deal with race and racial issues are so severe that when you take on these issues, you carry an immense burden. So what often happens is that there's an expectation for you to speak about these issues as unconstructively as possible. Okay? And we know this. Many of you may have attended discussions of people talking about race, and you get a sense that some people are just remaining silent enough and just tune out the speaker because they've already come in what they want to say about it. And then when the speaker stops speaking, then they just say what they came in to say anyway. So and that's part of the art of learning not to listen, not to communicate. And to make matters even worse, quite often, there are these rituals of how to speak about racial issues. And among the rituals is to go in, but you expect to encounter an impasse. In other words, you're expected to show up as if you're looking for the proverbial God who never arrives. So what happens is, it's a ritual in doing nothing. So when I say constructive then, constructively, when I use the adverb constructively, I'm using it intentionally in an ambiguous way. On the one version, you could talk about it in the sense of constructed. And many of you have learned this as you go through the academy. Race, for instance, they'll tell you is a social construction. Frantz Fanon, for instance, when he said one of the things about the black as a category is the black is a white construction. Okay? But Fanon also had another way of talking about constructively. And for those of you who don't know who Fanon was a revolutionary psychiatrist, philosopher, political thinker, etc., etc. But the other constructively is that Fanon had a healthy impatience against doing nothing. Okay? So a form of talking about something constructively should mean you go somewhere with it. So as I speak with you today, I'm hoping you get some things that could get you to go somewhere. And so if you think about the neurotic position, this is completely against the neurotic model. Because as you know, with neurosis often takes the form of saying, there's a problem, I can't seem to get something done, it's happening all around me, I don't know what it is. And one of the tasks of psychoanalysis is to say, my brother, my sister, the problem is you. Okay? So, I'm going to start with I'm going to lay out some things that I hope in our discussion afterward would be useful. So the first thing is, of course, when we say constructed in the first sense, it means we have to say that races didn't always exist. It's a very straightforward point. It just didn't always exist. And in fact, a lot of people talk about race, but they don't really look at this point. And there are other lectures I give where I talk about the whole history of the concept, its etymology, in Andalusia, or in the Middle Ages in Iberia, from the concept of raza, etc. But the basic point, the very basic point, is that prior to the emergence of Euro-modernity, there was no reason for the people we now know under certain racial designations, for instance, as black, or the way we look at East Asians, or the way we think of Native Americans, or even, and this is important here, Europeans did not exist. There was a world of Christendom. There was a world of different conflicts among people who were Jews and Muslims. And in the rest of the world, people were just doing their own thing. They were just minding their own business. But as we know, when Columbus landed here, a bunch of events had happened in the 15th century. The first was Ferdinand and Isabel defeating the Moors in Grenada. The next was ratcheting up the Inquisition. And the third was Columbus landing in the Bahamas. And within that constellation of events, something happened. Now, one of the catchwords, one of the things you should notice is you notice I said Euro-modernity. And this is one of the things you need to think through. Because most people, when they say the word modernity or modern, okay, from modus, from mode, they often treat the category European and the category modern as if they're the same thing. So it makes it easy for Europeans, the people we call Europeans. Hey, we need some moderns. Europeans say, here we are. However, what is very curious is then some people try to be specifically historical. Well, it's a concept in the 19th century, blah, 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 blah. It's a European concept, but then something strange. You treat the treatment of modern as if it's a 19th century concept, but then particularly in philosophy, well, then we leap over and we call Descartes modern. And, word has it, Descartes wasn't from the 19th century. He was a lot earlier. And so there are all of these ways in which modern is used but not defined. So I'm going to offer a definition that could be a little helpful, I hope. The definition is that actually there have been many moderns. The modern emerges when people meet in a conflictual situation such as colonialism, in which the question is, who belongs to the future? You see? So that means that if you go and look through history, whether you're dealing with, for instance, ancient Kemetans, whom we call Egyptians, whether you're dealing with Hittites, whether you're dealing with Assyrians, Babylonians, whether you move to the Macedonian Empire or look through Rome, all the way through the caliphates, the main problem that always emerges when people are colonized or conquered is they debate among each other, should we follow the direction of the people who colonized or conquered us? Or should we try our best to survive given that situation? Now, what often happens is this. In the moment of colonization or conquest, the people who are able to force themselves on others assert themselves as the future. And what that means is, if you're the future, think about it, if you're the future, that means you're the direction in which humanity is going. You got it? Which means you retroactively make your present legitimate. Which means you retroactively make your past, leading to this present that creates your future, legitimate. If, however, you're people who do not belong to the future, then that delegitimates your present, which means you properly belong to the past, which means if you're still here, what are you? You're an illegitimate present, or, as many Native Americans or First Nation people call it, a ghost. You're treated as if you haunt the society in which you live. And we do that if you think about the way in this society we look at First Nation peoples. You know, they're the images of the kind of spiritual, ghostly Native American. You know what I mean? They're like, and think about it, if you're a ghost, it means you're here, but nobody can see you or hear you. So voicelessness becomes a big issue. And then with other groups, this sort of not properly belonging to the present takes additional forms. So what happens, of course, is this notion of belonging to the past created something different. And that is the notion of primus or primitive. So literally, the primitive is something that is produced by this assertion of who belongs to the future. Now, something different happened in the kind of modernity that emerged in the transition from Christendom to Euromodernity. Because you see, the first thing you should ask is, well, if there were all these other modernities, why didn't this kind of stuff happen? Well, you see, the other modernities had this idea that it was fundamentally about, when you say who will belong to the future, it wasn't biological or flesh or so forth. It was about laws and activities. It was about deeds. So there was a way to belong to the future by, for instance, fusing your laws with those who colonized you, which is something that happened, for instance, in the relationship of ancient Judea with Rome. That fusion created Christianity, rabbinic Judaism, things like that. So it became a way then in your actions to belong to the future. You see? But what was different about what happened from the 15th century onward was that it wasn't any longer about your action. It transformed itself into a notion of your inner physical being. You see? So that means, even if you speak the language of the people who colonized you, even if you follow the laws, even if you use their modes of art representation, you do all the things people used to do. The problem was the idea that you, physically you, did not belong to that future. In effect, what was different about what created Europeans, the conception of First Nation peoples as indigenous, Africans as black, what was different is that it brought along a philosophical anthropology of who belongs to the future. You see the difference? And so that means then new kinds of beings emerged in the world. You see? There was no reason for an ancient African to call her or himself black. She or he may have said words such as Nubian, or before that Talense, Zulu, Xhosa. Hang out in South Africa, so I know how to do the click. Okay? All these terms. But suddenly, with the category black constructed as the antithesis of what it was to be white, created this bizarre problem. It created for other groups, but I'll choose blacks as an example. It literally created for blacks the historical reality of being indigenous to the Euro-modern world. You got it? But that world has defined itself as legitimate if you are absent. In effect, it means you do not belong to the world in which you're indigenous. And that situation I call black melancholia. Yeah, melancholia, in psychoanalysis, melancholia, the separation, the bereavement. The problem is that you literally become the problem of being black. You see? Now, there are many ways people respond to it. Some people accept that as a negative term. They see to be black is to be exclusively negative, or they may see being Native American to be exclusively negative. And that's say black with a small b. But there are those who say, wait a minute, why must I be as what is imposed upon me and my group? What if all this is nonsense and I try to fight and struggle for a world in which, okay, I may not know exactly what I was before, but why don't I change that small b to a big B and be an agent of history? What if and the moment I could think of myself in the future, now there is Afro-modernity, there's Indo-modernity. You see what I'm getting at? There's Islamo-modernity, there's Sino-modernity, because you now realize that the extent to which you see a future in which you belong, that rewrites your present as an agent of history. Now, there are people who have taken that path, and that path leads to a bunch of questions. Now, one of the areas in which I'm known is Africana philosophy, African diasporic philosophy. And what I argue is that African diasporic philosophy generates three questions that are actually questions of modernities, and they're questions that we should be thinking about today. One of the questions should be quite obvious. Because if Euro-modernity claims that certain people are people, the question is going to be, what the hell are people? What are human beings? And if Euro-modernity constructs itself as the standard of what it is to be human, then you can respond to it. For instance, one of the classic ways is saying, what the hell are you saying? What are you talking about me not being human? I'm as human as you are. However, there's a problem with that response. The problem with that response is if I say I'm as human as you are, I've made you the standard of being human. What if you're a low standard? Should I make racism, sexism, homophobia, et cetera, the standard? So then, but what if I say, I will be the standard? I still have a problem, right? What gives me the right to be the standard? And in fact, I suddenly find myself interrogating the very standard of what it is to be human. And that puts us on the path of philosophical anthropology. Now, there's a longer lecture I give on philosophical anthropology, but I just wanted to right now just outline how the problem emerges. The next one becomes a pretty obvious one. If you're talking about colonialism, enslavement, racism, you're talking about assaults on freedom. So, as an object of philosophical reflection, as a practice, freedom becomes a big issue. And we know it's a big issue because nobody talks about freedom more than a lot of the people who have been trying to block other people's freedom. Right? You all know it's been bellowing from hall to hall. If you're an American, you have heard about freedom. What's bizarre about it, though, then you read that, the founding fathers, always these fathers founding. It's very weird. You ever notice people don't talk about founding mothers? And later on I could talk about some of the reasons where that emerges. But these founding fathers, and when they actually wrote that they're looking for freedom. They tried to treat themselves as being treated as enslaved in relation to Britain, to which, of course, the enslaved Africans were saying, say what? You know? So I could tell you one thing about freedom is what I want. So freedom becomes a big issue. And one of the issues about freedom, of course, is the extent to which people could talk about it while making rigorous implements of enslavement. So now you get to this very tricky thing. If you're going to talk about freedom, you're going to talk about philosophical anthropology, they're related to other issues. For instance, people talk about identity, they talk about liberation. But of course, you could say, if you're going to talk about liberation, who's been liberated? So you go to the identity. If you're going to talk about the identity, can your identity exist without actually having a purpose or going somewhere? After a while, you see a symbiotic relationship between liberation and identity. And before you know it, you get into the third element. And the third element is what I call the metacritique of reason. And that is because the elephant in the room, when philosophers come to talk, when theorists come to talk, when intellectuals come to talk, we have to deal with a basic fact, which is that rationality, science, thinking, those things have been used for practices of dehumanization. In other words, if we're going to really push all the question of what Karl Jaspers called the hymn to which philosophers sing, reason, we're going to have to explain why so many so-called reasonable people made rigorous the degradation of others. So, within that framework, then, we have a basic problem. And that problem is, how do you justify justification? It's pretty radical, huh? And it's not just me saying it. A lot of philosophers have said this. There are many you're familiar with, like Kant. Hegel looked at this issue, all the way through to, for instance, Sartre's critique of dialectical reason. But what you may not know is that these are issues that have been looked at by many African philosophers and many women philosophers. Many of you may not know that Christine de Pizarro, right? In the Renaissance, this woman wrote about that problem. Many of you may not know about Wilhelm Amo, who taught at the University of Halle, an African, thought about these issues in that way. Many of you may not know about Kugano. And I wrote, if you're saying, oh my God, he's given a list. For those of you curious, you could look at a book I wrote called An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, where I talk about those people. But now that said, I'm going to now move through the question of the way we talk about race and racism with those foundations there. So the first thing is, if you're going to talk about race and racism, let me just give a definition of racism. Just throw it out there, okay? So racism, the way I'm going to be using it, is the institutional production of non-human status to groups of human beings with the consequence of a race or set of races being treated as inferior or superior to others. Okay? If they're treated as inferior, their social options are limited. If they're treated as superior, man, they got a lot of options. Okay? Very basically put there. Now, you could already see the problem when I said a group of human beings being treated as non-human beings. And in my writings, I call that bad faith. It's always struck me as weird that if you at least learn to develop a racist attitude or position, it means you got to identify a human being and then say that's not a human being. Now, you notice people don't go around trying to identify dogs or cats in racial terms, even though the term originally referred to breeds of animals. And so there's a performative contradiction in finding people and then denying their people. Okay? And this is something crucial to remember because, you see, one of the things that actually brought me to philosophy was something that I noticed when I was a high school teacher. I always thought in these ways as a child, and particularly when I did work in music and other areas. But when I was a high school teacher, something struck me. If you treat a human being as a human being, she or he flourishes. if you treat a human being as not a human being, he or she withers. And it's always struck me as odd because, you see, you should know you're a human being already. If you know you're a human being already, why does it matter that you're treated as a human being? You see what I'm saying? And the short answer, again, because there's not time to develop some of these things, is because, you see, something fundamental about being human beings is that human beings are relationships. So if you treat people as human beings, you're establishing human relations. If you dehumanize people, you're pushing them outside of the realm of relations and relationships. And so, in effect, you're turning them into things. And this is something that's very crucial because, you see, the world we live in, even though I started off with talking about Euromodernity, there are other examples of how these things emerge. For instance, we live in a world in which we talk a lot about capitalism. Right? People, boy, especially with this White House, right? Capitalism. But you know, people talk about capitalism, and some people get to the point where they often go from capitalism to talking about the market. Right? Yet, some of you may not realize that there was a time when people didn't talk about the market. They talked about markets, plural. If you look at our species, particularly if you're an anthropologist, or what you know is that at least for 150,000 years, there have been markets. Human beings are always meeting to trade. And when human beings would go to markets, their goal wasn't, well, let me see how much I'll profit. The reason people went to markets was to meet other people. They would spend time, they would get news. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have news stations. They didn't have radio. They would go through processes, and that's why with our species, news traveled. If you look at history, you know, it's bizarre that someone could say, what's that? Oh, it's an axe. What's an axe? Well, and before you know it, all over the place, there are axes. What's that? It's a net. We fish. Oh, well, you catch animals. It spreads. Ideas, etc. Markets were very human institutions. However, at the period of the emergence of Euromodernity, some people emerged who said, you know, the problem with markets is they're too human. If we can get the human out of the market as much as possible, then we could have markets that are efficient, profitable, blah, 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 blah. In fact, we moved to an abstraction like a god that we call the market. And that kind of reasoning happens in a lot of other areas of human life. To put it very bluntly, the human being becomes a problem. The task that's been sold to us is that if we can get ourselves out of our relationship with each other, somehow we can have a more efficient world. And so you could see how that works very well with enslavement, colonialism, etc. So now that we get a little question about racism, I want to get to some of the things that I would argue are they're not constructive when we talk about these issues. So the first one I want to bring up is moralism. One of the reasons it's hard to talk about race issues is because a lot of people start immediately into the question of moralizing. Okay? They get moralistic. And so what happens is if you get moralistic and you're talking to somebody about racism, then it becomes the question of whether the person who's disagreeing with you is immoral. And so it shifts from talking about racism into personalizing the conversation. You see? And within that way of talking about these issues, you begin to get into a set of other things that become weird. For instance, when I'm in South Africa, this problem of moralism becomes so severe that even when people show up to do political activist meetings, I notice that they're quickly getting into moralism. And here's the way moralism goes. First, they have to find out who is behaving in a morally proper way to belong to the meeting. So you throw them out. Then you get to those who are left who are not moral enough, so you throw them out. And then after a while, it's just you and your buddy. But then you and your buddy look at each other and your buddy is not moral enough. But then if you're left with yourself, you know what you do if you're not moral enough? You've got to take yourself out back and shoot you. The problem, in other words, with moralism is that moralism collapses into a form of purity. And purity puts you outside of the relations with others. If you're in a relationship with others, you're dealing with what is fundamentally impure. But I often also put it this way. You know, I don't worry too much when it comes to these issues about how moral a lot of people are. What bothers me, and if you think about the definition of racism I offered you, is that there are people who are immoral who have power. In short, it's not that there are immoral people in the world, it's that they're on top of me. They're on top of you. They're on top of others. If we can get them off of us, then they could be immoral all they like on the other side of the room. However, if you're a moralist, you're not satisfied with them being on the side of the room. You see what I'm getting at? You have to cleanse the room. And so suddenly, your effort to make the world moral, collapses into a form of cleansing that creates this situation of a form of immoral morality. Moralism, in other words, makes you lose sight of what are political relationships. So if we come to these, here are some of the ways in which we have a tendency to miss these issues. One of them is color blindness. Another one is a very treasured term. You all hear it, race relations. The next one is racial tensions. And another one is privilege. So I'm going to talk about each of these, okay? Start with color blindness. Now, a lot of people say, you know, the problem with racism is that we see races. If I could stop seeing you as black or whatever, it could be cool. Now, let me put the analogy at the level of gender. Okay? Let's just make it very heteronormative. A man asks a woman out for a date, they're going to date, everything's going great, the date is going wonderful because they're just laughing. She even starts the curling the hair thing. You know, he does the mat the shoulders thing. Everything's going good. And then at the end of the evening, they go, and he's saying, yeah, I had a good time. She says, I had a good time too. And he said, there's only one thing that will make it perfect. And she said, what? And he said, you know, if I could stop seeing you as a woman, I could really respect you. What do you think? Second date? And there's some people who say, hell no. Because it should be obvious. If not to see a woman as a woman is what's required to see her, there's a word for that. It's called misogyny. That is what hating women is. But what's odd is colorblindness literally does the same thing. It says, in order to respect, let's just choose black people, you have to not see black people as black people to respect them. And in my language, that's called anti-black racism. So in effect, what we don't realize is colorblindness is a form of racism. I shouldn't have to disappear in order to be respected. You see? You can see how that connects to that early point about the modern. If I disappear, go to the past where you belong. So, colorblindness, bad. The next one is racial tensions. Now, this one is special. I hate this term. People love it. Racial tensions. First of all, racial tensions, it buys into the moralistic individualism that hides the political matter of institutions of power and cultivated inequalities. Racial tensions treat the situation as if it's symmetrical. You see? Because where, tensions exist, for example, if two people are attracted to each other, there could be a tension. And you need to release. I love in Rocky Horror Show when he says, to relieve my tension. Okay? But the problem with this racial tension model is it oversimplifies racism. It gives the impression as if racism is like, just give them a back rub. You know what I mean? Come on, and then suddenly, the neo-Nazi and, I don't know, Cornel West or whoever, because he was at the march, they start making out. Okay? But the other part that's attractive to people and why it's problematic of racial tensions is that it buys into an obsession in our society, which is the both sides discourse. You see? It presumes there's a symmetrical relationship in racial conflicts. When, if you step back and look at all the evidence reveals very clearly that institutional resources, governing power, and more are on the racist side of the equation. Even when you look at something like Charlottesville, look, this is just well known in the history of this country. A lot of police officers are members of white supremacist groups. There are all kinds of organizations that were even founded for the very purpose of harming certain groups. A lot of our laws, one of the reasons it was illegal to smoke opium, but it was fine to have it, was because Chinese smoked opium. Though a lot of the laws, drug laws, are targeted to specific ethnic and racial groups, from marijuana all the way through. So it's ridiculous to talk about symmetry, okay? But the symmetry presupposes an equal playing field. And a lot of times, we go for this symmetrical discourse because it's connected to a lot of other issues. It's something that comes out of, for instance, liberalism, which I'll talk about a little. But let me just go to the next one, because the next one may surprise a lot of you. What a lot of people love to talk about when we bring up race and racism, and it's really hot right now, and people are shocked that I reject this discourse. People love the word privilege. And the thing about the word privilege, as many of you may know, the whole discourse around privilege began with a particular discourse around, and it actually was developed out of white racial theory. Okay? The idea was to say that as a white person, you are privileged. And from that basis, of course, now when you're dealing with race issues, you need to acknowledge your privilege, say, to a black or a brown person. Now let's unpack this. Okay? Let's unpack this. The question of racism emerges. You get up and you look at a black or brown person and say, oh my God, I'm so privileged. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm so bad with my privilege. And the black or brown person says, yeah, you privileged. So then you let out your privilege. You cry it out. And then you go home, and that black or brown person go home with all the institutions of power remaining intact. But you are now feeling better as a privileged moral person who acknowledged your privilege. In other words, it does nothing about racism. The second problem with the privilege discourse, and I think a very dangerous one, look carefully at the things we call privilege. After a while, it's gotten so bad that even black and brown people are complaining about their privilege. You have black and brown students saying, I'm privileged, I go to college. I'm privileged, I have a home. I'm privileged, I have, and this is no small matter in Detroit, clean water. And Flint. I'm privileged because I breathe clean air. I'm privileged You see where this is going? The problem with the privilege discourse is people are being called privileged for having things everyone should have as a human right. If you should have it as a human right, there's something pathological in telling you to give it up. Are you to give up good education? Are you to give up being treated fairly by a legal system? Are you to give up having access to food, shelter? Are you to give up respect as a human being? That is absurd. And that's why it creates guilt. Because we demand in the privileged discourse for white people to do something that makes absolutely no sense. So what should we be saying instead? You see, that's why it goes nowhere. It's the moralistic discourse. That's why, for me, a particular moralistic publication is the New York Times. I know people beat up on the news these days, but they love black and brown people to write stuff that make white people feel just guilty and cry about their privilege. You know, they love it. They're like, oh man, this is going to be some good stuff here. You know? However, there is a better formulation. You see, what race and racism, what racism produces is not privilege. Because you see, privilege is a good. It's a privilege for me to be able to speak in front of you. It's a privilege that Riklin had the ability to give something to a city he loves. It's a privilege when you get your education to carry those skills into the world. Privileges are goods. In fact, a lot of times when you get a diploma, it says the rights and privileges. However, think about it. It's never a privilege to lynch people. Could you say, I have the privilege of raping you? That makes no sense. I have the privilege of torturing you. Would you like me to use chains, acid? Think through, if you think carefully, those are not privileges. Those are license. In political philosophy, we make a distinction between freedom and license, between liberty and license. If you have a liberty, it doesn't follow you have the license to torture. If you're free, it doesn't mean you have the license to torture, rape, pillage, degrade others. In the universities, people are always talking about political correctness, for instance. It's such a nonsense discussion. But it was developed by the right in a similar way privilege was developed around race, because you see, what the right is really talking about, but if they put it in that language, it loses its force, is moral correctness. You see? Because you see, when they say free speech, you're not really talking about speech. They're talking about having access to a license to harm. That's very different. Because you see, words are never just words. You could use words, and I don't mean like just hurting feelings. Words can also be used to lead to the death of others. Nobody has that right. Nobody has that. That's not a privilege. But if you have a license, then whatever harm happens, you show your license. You see? I'll give you an example. The most popular, the most iconic example of license is James Bond. Because everybody knows James Bond. What does James Bond have? A license to kill. So you can imagine being Bond, right? Walks up. The cops come, yo, got a license. Oh, man. Okay, kill away. But if you think about that, think about it, when you tag a license onto a group, that is what's behind remarks like Donald Trump's when he said, I could just go shoot someone in Midtown Manhattan, it'll be fine. I could go talk about grabbing women's vagina. It's fine. It's a license. And in fact, the people who identify with them are nostalgic for when, by virtue of being defined as white, you have that license. Because all of you have seen, at some point, photographs of white people having a picnic, posing for a picture in front of the mangled, burnt body of someone whom they dragged through the streets, they chopped off limbs, lynched up, burnt, and they posed with their children in the picture. So people are like, oh man, we don't know who did it. I mean, they did it, but they had a license. A license means that no matter what the injustice is in your relation to another, the license permits you to go scot-free. You see? That's the nostalgia. And within that framework, I come to the next point. Here's the interesting thing when you think about it as a license, not a privilege. I once asked a group of students, not students, a group of colleagues actually, and students, if you were just given a license to kill, what would you do? Now, some people at first said, well, I'll make a list. But very quickly, there was someone who said, it got to the point where I'm not going to act on such a license. And in fact, and then again to another person who says, I don't think people should have such a license. But I said, but it's handed to you whether you want it or not. And eventually some people say, well, I'll start trying to find a way for people not to have that license. You see what I'm getting at? When you think about it in terms of license, now, whatever your racial background, there's something you can do. A white person could say, I didn't ask for this, but if you're going to say that, it means you got to go do something. And there's something realistic you can do something about. You can do something about laws that are designed to make sure there's impunity, that you can do things as whites without any accountability. You can do something about what leads to economic policies of structural inequality. You can do something because political action is about doing things. And it means you don't have to deal with white guilt. Yes, you have advantages, but you're fighting against a license that places options more in your favor, and you're also addressing the fact that what you want are others to have these privileges that you have, because there really are privileges, but privileges, everyone should have a right to good education. That's why there are public universities. Everyone should have a right for the long list of things that we have been calling privileges. And you know who likes the privilege discourse? Those who actually want to take those privileges away from you. Because think about it. If enough white people are saying, oh yeah, I want to get rid of my things like health care and public education, etc., you know who is going to like that? Well, right now, the people who control all branches of the government. In addition to that, the corporate individuals to whom they're beholden. In addition to that, the plutocrats and kleptocrats across the globe, because it's not just the United States. They're doing it all across Europe. They're doing it all across Asia. They're doing it all across Africa. They're doing it all across South America. So if we understand, if we clarify what we're doing, we can have some transformation there. So I'm going to close then with an observation. In the United States, well, not just here, it happens also in England, in Germany. One of the things that ushered in this moralistic stuff was an effort to push genuine political philosophy to the side. So if you go to many places and you study what's called political philosophy in the United States, and you look at it carefully, it's really applied moral philosophy. It's not political philosophy. You see? And because it is such, it gives the illusion that somehow you individually are the person who is the politics. But the thing that you have to think about when you look at these, and again, I'm not trying to spell it out, but these moralistic discourses, is they never talk about power. Political institutions make no sense without power. If you're going to do political philosophy, you must address power, which means if racism is political, it's about power. And when we think about power, the other thing they almost never do is to define it. In fact, many of you these days, people got so bad that a form of decadence and theorizing emerged. People don't even think about the concept. They just think about who is most associated with it. So for many people who say power, they go, Foucault? Power, Nietzsche? They don't think about power. And many people don't even, in fact, to the point where people have been convinced to be against power. But just as I talked about privilege, I got to tell you, power is a good thing. Power is the human ability to make things happen. If you lack that, you can't even get up in the morning. You can't even do anything. And one of the great things human beings did is to expand power into what we call a social world. And we expand that social world into institutions, whether they're governing institutions, educational institutions, all these things are manifestations of power. And when we talk about power, we have to understand power is empowering. But if you use power to take power from others, that's also an ability. That is disempowering, dehumanizing, etc. So the project, if you take these issues on, the political project, is about the democratic transformation of power. You see? So I close then with two observations. And they're from a philosopher that's not often talked about, but he's very important to talk about, I think, today. And there are others who joined him on this, but I just figured I'd bring him up. His name is Karl Jaspers. And what Karl Jaspers observed is that we often talk about responsibility as if it's a singular thing. But he differentiated legal responsibility from moral responsibility from political responsibility. Moral responsibility, legal responsibility is obvious, whether you obey the law or not. But moral responsibility is about what you do. But he observed something crucial about political responsibility. You see, the reason people take these issues so personally is because they're treating them as moral responsibility. However, and so a good example is the white immigrant says, hey man, I didn't create slavery and racism here. It's not my fault. And to which it's not like you're a god. There's a form of narcissism that comes with racism. But political responsibility says this. It's that every member, everybody under the jurisdiction of the governing institutions of power bear the responsibility for the actions of those institutions. That means whether you voted for this government or not, everyone in this room is responsible politically. It means it's not only white people who are politically responsible for enslavement and racism, it's everybody in the society. Because you see, the thing about license, just as you say no one should have the license, it means that you have to see what your governing institutions should be. You see what I'm getting at? And what's even worse about this, because he had to argue about it from the standpoint of somebody who was in Nazi Germany, who fought against it, who lived through it, and he said that as the losers in that battle, he equally carried the political responsibility of that society. You see what I'm getting at? So how our government behaves is a serious issue. Is it behaving in a way that will grant, if it were vanquished, mercy? And when we say that, you know, some people say, oh, well, you know, they're going to take away our political leaders. No. Even if, and here's what's bizarre about political responsibility, even if you're undocumented, even if you're a non-citizen, you're in the political jurisdiction of the actions here in any country you are. And this is a radical concept. Because you see, when you understand it that way, you can answer the question of who is to do something, not only about racism, but about the global dehumanization of our species. And the answer is very straightforward. Everyone. Thank you.
In a minute, we'll have questions. I think I should apologize to you first.
Oh, it's not the brother. It gave me a nice joke.
Well, I misintroduced you. That's both disrespectful to you and personally embarrassing to you. So I apologize. So let's break for a minute and come back and have questions in like 5 minutes.
Okay. I'm not, by the way, I'm not insulted. I love Lewis Black.
I know Lewis Black. But no, that's embarrassing. It's embarrassing you to...
No, it's not quite logical. It made me know you love Lewis Black.
Yeah.
Lewis says you had similar questions. Someone just said something about the reception.
So do you want to make an announcement?
I was going to say one thing. There is
Oh.
a res-
Yeah, go ahead.
one thing. There is a reception afterwards. It's upstairs in the third floor community room. I'll remind you of that again.
Okay. Okay, the first thing I want to say is I have a very unusual ability, which is that I can take I'd like everybody who has a question to ask the question, okay? It may sound odd, but that way I prefer if everybody who has questions get to ask them, and then I'll proceed to all of them. And people sometimes doubt it, but there are times I can take up to 60 or 70. So it's a unique brain ability. So, I know. Now people want to challenge me, right? But for now, so everybody who has a question, the only thing I ask is please say your name. That way, because you could probably guess, I take very seriously we should talk to people, and I don't like people to be nameless. So say your name, ask your question, all of you, and then I will respond. That way, we'll make sure that at least everybody who's here was able to voice what she or he has to say. Okay, so yes. Loudly for everybody.
My name is Graham. It's good to see you again.
Mm-hmm.
And first off, I just want to say thanks for doing the talk. I thought it was fantastic. And I have kind of a clarification question. So I was wondering if we could rewind a bit back to the talk that you had on colorblindness and some of your worries about that. And if I understood the argument correctly, it was roughly, suppose that you're going out with this woman and everything's going great, and then you're like, oh, if only I could see you as not a woman, that'd be awesome. And there's obviously something really awful about that, and it's almost like you're asking the person to disappear in some sense because you can't really respect them for who they are. And then to draw that analogy to talking about these race relations. But I was wondering, I felt like in the example of the date, there's certainly a distinction between sex and gender, but it kind of sounded like you're going on a date with this woman, and part of who she is, at least a little bit, is she is a woman in some real sense, and so to not acknowledge that is to kind of deny her in some sense. But if I followed what you were doing earlier, it sounded like when you're going over the history, it sounded like you were in some way committed to the idea that race is in some sense not like that. I mean, in some sense, it's like a construction. There was a period where we didn't really have it, and then we got to a point where we did have it, and we had different versions of it. And so I was wondering if someone, I feel like a lot of people when they talk about colorblindness, it's not so much that they deny that fundamental aspect of who you are, and thus you in some way have to go invisible for them to respect you. I thought it was more of the idea, it's look, there's this wrong construction that gives you a kind of identity that isn't really yours. In some real sense, you are not black. And when I say colorblindness, it's not me wanting you to disappear. It's me acknowledging that that isn't a real part of your identity, and I want to be the kind of person that doesn't attach that to you and doesn't label you that way. And so I've heard people have that sort of thought, and I was wondering what you had to say about that.
Okay. Yes. Say your name for everybody.
My name is Debbie. I think you made a lot of good points with regard to the problematic kinds of discourse we have about colorblindness and privilege and things like that. So I guess I was wondering, do you think that we should purge this kind of discourse from the way that we talk and think about race altogether? And if so, I have a worry about that. Particularly, we talk, and when we talk about feminism, we talk about male privilege a lot, too. My concern about purging those kinds of terms is that we use them for a reason. The discourse has come about for a reason. And so my concern is that we just have a whole class of euphemisms that smuggle in the same underlying problems that create the problems with the discourse to begin with. I'm not sure if my question makes sense.
Your question makes sense?
Yeah, so for example, if we start talking about license rather than privilege, does license just become a euphemism for privilege while the same underlying problems
Your name?
I'm sorry, my name is Blanche. We started talking about post-racialism and also colorblindness. We rob social justice and agent of change, and that is the category of race and the category of gender. But that aside, I look at ways in which the legal system, both procedurally and substantively, ratify wrongdoing. And what I mean by that is I'm drawing analogies between this recent spate of unarmed shootings of white police officers and black people and issues involving sexual violence like rape. And there's a way in which the law can be complicit in that. I'm particularly intrigued about your ideas involving license, because there's a way in which the law becomes complicit in that enterprise such that it ratifies the license to conduct and perform a certain kind of violence on vulnerable bodies. So I just wanted anything you had to say about that.
Okay. Yes.
My name is Elvira Jason. I really enjoyed the talk. I wanted to ask you a question about your discussion of modernity. So I really like the characterization of what specify what kind of modernity we're talking about, and specifically philosophers not acknowledge their positionality in Euro-modernity, and to think of alternative kinds of modernities as challenging or giving alternative interpretations in terms of freedom, self-determination, and what it means to be part of a political community. So I was thinking specifically looking at Afro-modernity in American political thought as offering a challenge to Euro-modernity, for example, in terms of how we conceptualize citizenship or civic belonging. And so I was wondering then how you would imagine how these different discourses on modernity could talk to each other or relate to each other. And if you ultimately envision this kind of higher order reconciliation of, here is how we ought to think about freedom that is truly racially inclusive and humanistic and reasonable and compassionate. And so it's a kind of a vision of what modernity is. It's historically and self-conscious and
Is that everybody? Yeah. Yes.
Thinking about
Got to say your name.
Jackie, sorry. Thinking about the responsibility of the governing piece, does that obligate people to be politically involved? I mean, is that the implication that we should be doing something if the governing body is, I don't want to get too moralistic. But I guess I'm asking, is that the responsibility to become politically involved?
Okay. Yes. Please say your name.
Linda. I really enjoyed your talk. There was one part that just sort of put my teeth on edge a little bit because it strikes close to home. So when you were talking about the different modernities, I don't know if you meant to say Islamic modernity or whether it just came out, but clearly, Islam is a race, and it's often equated as being racial. And one of the problems with that, of course, is hypergeneralization. Right? So I just wanted you to.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Penny, and I really enjoyed your take on it. I was really not expecting the way you brought it up from that perspective, like the humanity perspective. I thought you were going to actually talk about how, how we can not think of it racely, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that it's there, and to say that, you are not black or whatever, or white or something like that, that doesn't mean that that's true, because you evidently see that as, like, in general. I'm not saying as, like, it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that what we perceive is what is there. You can't, it's kind of like, you can't, to think that it doesn't there and to insist that it's not there, when it's actually evident that we have this issue. I think that people should be more aware of it, like you said, instead of trying to think, oh no, race doesn't exist, there's no issue, like we have this mindset to kind of, people are actually unaware of racism sometimes. Because they're like, I actually, like you said in the beginning, like if I don't view as, what Graham said, if I don't view as this certain color, I'm actually taking it, oh, I'm not racist, you know? I'm trying to see you as a person. But that doesn't make sense, in a way. And also I want to go back, what do you mean by bullied intentionally? And no, not intentionally, kind of like bullied intellectually, and so bullied you that we shouldn't talk about this.
Okay. I think Johnny has one.
Hey, yeah, my name is Johnny. I thought it was really interesting that you define racism in exclusively institutional terms, the institutional production of inferior status. Because we had the philosopher Jenny Saul who came and gave us a talk just yesterday. And she said she thinks that at least among white Americans, maybe white Europeans as well, we have a kind of folk concept of racism, which is which conceives of racism as exclusively a property of an individual person. That conceives of racism as being a set of beliefs or attitudes that an individual person has. So I'm curious to know whether you think that she's right, that she's diagnosed the kind of folk theory correctly, and then whether you think that there's any use for a concept of racism as an individual trait, as opposed to this institutional thing.
Okay. Yes.
What do you think?
Oh, your name?
Oh, sorry.
Your name? Yeah.
Yeah, Mike McKinsey.
Mhm.
Sorry. What do you think of the idea that came through to me when you were making some discussion of modernity being a kind of justification for racism? I mean, it looks like it's just one enormous, rather stupid lie that some groups of individuals use to put themselves in a good light, even when they're treating other human beings not as human beings at all, but as instruments of their own pocket.
So my
Got to tell everybody else.
Oh.
Your
my
name for everyone.
Question is
Okay.
related to John. And I also thought your definition of racism was very interesting because, as John mentioned, we think that the source of racism is this belief in the racial superiority or inferiority, whereas you said it's a consequence, that racial superiority or inferiority is a consequence. So to be a consequence, I think you think of it as political superiority or inferiority, rather than some innate feature of these different races. And I also thought, well, I also want to ask a question. Do you think that this superiority, inferiority is a necessary condition of racism? Because I could think of some races who are not tied to some inferiority or superiority. Nonetheless, they are objects of racism. And so I just wondered whether this superiority is a necessary condition or that there are other forms of racism, which is merely institutional exclusion, right? And I like the way you actually define it as an institutional production, but that some races, that it's not a ranking of some capacity, but merely this desire for exclusion in institutions that motivates.
Okay. Oh, two more. Yeah.
Cynthia?
Hi, Cynthia.
Hi. I'm wondering if, or what you think regarding this issue that we face, if we actually intentionally devoted more time to introspection, if we would not have the issues that we have, because we would consider not competing with others, but being well within ourselves, where we don't feel the need to put other people down to make ourselves feel better.
Okay. Yes. Your name? As I said, please don't call me Shirley.
I'm wondering if you published anywhere you work on license. And so if you could share that with us. And just really quickly, I'm looking at, sort of looking at racism or white supremacy or white rule patriarchy or supremacy. But that its end result is to create vulnerability for purposes of exploitation. Or Edward Said's work about using certain bodies as canvases for design, whatever that design may be, whether it's to kill, whether it's to rape, whether it's low-wage labor, or unpaid leave processing.
Okay. Well, the first, oh, go ahead. Okay. Well, the first thing is, what you could probably guess is that what I presented to you today is an outline, okay? Now, I've written quite a bit on not only that subject, but on many issues. And a lot of my work also writes that, builds in the nuances that are of some of the questions you've all asked, okay? And it's very easy if you want to get to look at some of those other writings. A former student created a website called lewisrgordon.com, and there's an article section, but if you look at the CVs, you'll see, it'll take a while. There are a lot of articles, a lot of different issues. I don't write exclusively on race or racism. I see it as part of a constellation of a larger issue. This is not to diminish it, but it's to illuminate it, okay? So it's always been strange to me that, for instance, many people who talk about race and racism don't give a theory of what they mean by a human being when they do it. Okay, so I talk a lot about those issues. When we think about these issues, the first thing, and I'm going to connect a lot of your questions because I'm hoping this would illuminate it. The first thing is, remember when I talked about power? And remember now, I was talking about power in a simultaneously phenomenological and dialectical way, okay? Phenomenologically, power is a relational concept, okay? So and dialectically, because human beings are able to evaluate what we do, then we always are negating the notion of our own completeness. So one of the ways to think about this is, for instance, a conversation between Fanon and Jean-Paul Sartre. When Fanon basically said, when Jean-Paul Sartre wrote Au fait noir, Black Orpheus, he treated the dialectical argument of overcoming racism as if it just followed as an absorption into a universal working class. But the working class was an abstraction. We all know this, that there are certain abstractions. Whenever abstract terms are used, they almost always mean white people. So for instance, the English as an example love to say, isn't it really class? But they only bring it up if you bring up race. And then if you notice when people talk about class, they speak about class, an abstraction, as if black people aren't part of class. In fact, in many places, the overwhelming population of the working class are black. It's heavily racialized. Yet, when they want to present class, they always present a white working class person. And I should tell you something. And it's not just it, there are many other examples. Abstractions often, and it's because white is normative. But there's more going on within those. When I talked about power and relations, and I talked about institutions, what I hoped many of you got, but I'll just make it explicit here, for me, there's no such thing as a non-human institution. You see, the way that I talked about capitalism was an effort to try to make markets seem like they could function without people. People got to make markets function. You see what I'm getting at? The critique is to take the agency and the people responsible for systems working. It would be as if to say you get rid of all the people at Wayne State and you still have Wayne State. Well, you could have shells of buildings, but that's not Wayne State. The reason Wayne State can be transformed is different generations embody and make it live as an institution. In my work in philosophy of the city, I say the same thing. Many people don't know what cities are. They think cities are big buildings. No, that's urban. But cities came out of citizenship. the activities people do that require a place in which to manifest power and politics. That's why there are many urban centers that are not cities anymore. What they are, Disney World. They're places where the affluent come to play and then they go back home to where they want to live. You see? And so one of the things that, in fact, one of the projects at a place like Detroit and New York for me stopped being a city a long time ago. Once Giuliani began to destroy it, it's now trying to reclaim itself as a city. This is the project Chicago. So one of the things we have to understand, when I say an institution, it's connected to your question, to Johnny's question, and to Catherine's. The question, when I say institutions, is that human beings build human relations that require human beings to manifest power. You see? So for me, it's not that institutions float separate from people. However, I completely reject those examples of the individual as racism. The reason is it commits the fallacy of confusing racists with racism. A racist is an individual who buys into racist beliefs or the system of racism. But I always joke, one of the things that racism does is to create a kind of oversensitivity of those in power. And what do you think? If you're a Koori, which is a name for a particular group of Aboriginals in Australia, what do you think? Are white people really threatened if Koori hate white people? No. I'm just saying, an individual with absolutely no power for the system to make a difference in the lives of people, that person could be could have a racist attitude, but that's not going to affect the lives of white Australians. You see? White Australians is a racism against the blacks of Australia, what they call the Aboriginal populations. You see? That's the asymmetry I'm talking about. One of the ways we get duped, and that's the individualist discourse, is something that emerged, and again, in a longer lecture, I bring out these relations. You could probably guess what I'm arguing against is a conception of the human being that treats a human being as a substance, completely individual of relationships with the rest of the world. And this is something that's very seductive. It's actually indigenous to the philosophical anthropology, believe it or not, of capitalism. Because if you look at Hobbesianism, if you look at a lot of the arguments that's used in that kind of Anglo-atomistic thought, it gives the impression that you can be physically an individual yourself with absolute power. The problem, and a beautiful analysis, many people, a lot of African philosophers give critiques, a critical position on this, but a beautiful critique of this issue is in part 1 of Jean-Paul Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason. Because if you can convince people enough that they're the ones in control, while you have conglomerates, systems, institutions of power, what do you think? Can you individually fight against corporate power? Can you individually fight against state power? Can you individually fight? You can go down the long list. You can wish it, but unless you're a god, and you know what gods are, gods have a different kind of power. It's metaphysical. If God says it will, it is, it is. But that's not human world. Human world produces power through human relations. So the first error that is already there is in these kind of individualized model. And part of it is we have confused philosophies of language, confused philosophical anthropologies. We have confused notion in our metaphysics of what people are. And a lot of them work very well in a system that produces vulnerability, because you're never more vulnerable than when you're alone. So this idea of being the individual producer of a phenomenon is highly problematic. Now, once we understand that, we'd have to build out a philosophical anthropology that is actually more dialectical. And when I say dialectical, again, a lot of people don't know what dialectical means. A lot of people have the cliched version. They think a dialectical argument is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's not dialectical, because you already know the outcome. Dialectical is where if you encounter a contradiction, in other words, in a non-dialectical situation, there's a universal. And the absolute other universal is the negation of that. So all are, none are. You got it? Both are universal, and they do not meet. However, if you have a contradiction, that's an interaction. If you say all are, well, some are not. And that's an interaction that now produces knowledge. Now, here's the error many people make. The error people make is when you have that dialectical moment of contradiction, people think it moves linearly. But if you look at a lot of African and African diasporic thought, and also people who do understand dialectics, people such as Gramsci, people such as Frantz Fanon, people such as why Sartre wrote The Critique of Dialectical Reason, when you have a contradiction, it suddenly makes you realize, oh, there's more than you thought there were. But that means you could go there, 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 there. You see what I'm getting at? There's so many directions when there's a contradiction that the path you take brings back on you the question of agency. So dialectics actually connects to agency, which makes it a very human activity. The human being already emerges as that which has stepped out of the permanence or the closure of being. And that stepping out raises all kinds of questions of negation. You can't think of thought, for instance, without a distinction. You know? So once we begin to get into this is where philosophy is cool. Because what's cool about philosophy at this point, as we begin to break down these new nuances, we begin to realize, for instance, when I talked about modernity, I wasn't arguing the problem was the modern. You see? I was arguing that the problem was to confuse the modern as something that's intrinsic to one particular group of people. You see the difference? Human beings are always producing the modern because human beings want to live into the future. So the very idea of saying only certain groups of human beings belong to the future, that is an imposition onto the modern. But it creates also, the problem is if we make the modern associated with the group who does that, then it makes the groups who are being negated anti-modern. And that's a disaster. Because if you're going to be properly anti-modern, then you have to make a decision not to belong to the future, which is really problematic. That's a form of disappearance. There are other things that become a problem. For instance, there's a whole area of philosophy that's against the idea of what they could consider Geist in German, or spirit, and for them, a lot of these things are like human ideas, etc. And I teach a course of philosophy of social science. I teach a course called Race in the Birth of the Human Sciences, where I'm very critical of those, the post-humanists, the post. In fact, one of the strange things about the posts, like post-racialists, is post is just a tag you put onto something where you could keep doing it, just say you're ashamed of it. So post-racism just means racism continued, but with shame. That's why it works so well for the moralists. What is post-colonialism? Well, it's not cool any longer, except for the all hoopla over that journal article recently defending colonialism, but it's not cool to say, you know what, we're going to go colonize them. Now you got to colonize them and say, but we're against colonialism. So colonialism, post-colonialism, is really colonialism continued, but ashamed of itself. Okay? And there are all of these versions of it. So that's one of the reasons why I don't do the post stuff. Okay? But the thing about it, that once we begin to break it down, this connects to one of the, so when I was bringing up the question, for instance, of Afro-modernity, one of the things, I only brought up a small set of things to start the discussion. But in my writings, I'm very critical of a bunch of what I call political myths. For instance, here's a political myth that's very seductive, that many people subscribe to and don't even realize it. The myth is, somewhere out there, there's a group of people who got it, the proverbial it, right. And all you got to do is find them and do what they do. Now, you could see the problem. Whether they're women, blacks, gays, trans, whether they're proletariat, Jews, Muslims, blah, blah, blah. The truth of the matter is the human being is not a set of gods. Human beings are not beings who got it right. Human beings are creatures trying to get it right. You see the difference? And we're working at it. But the notion that we have people out there who just got perfection, that's highly problematic. There are others, but one other really powerful political myth is you can solve anything if you bring a big enough crowd. It's the myth of the crowd. And so the idea is you get the biggest possible number of people and somehow you overcome problems. But the problem is the crowds also have to go home. And when they go home